Hello and welcome to week 46 of this 52-week series for the Web Pro on what every web administrator needs to know to be successful in this space. My name is Scott Forsyth, and today I'm picking up where I left off on a 4-week mini sub-series on IIS FTP. So today is week 3. The first week we talked about the basics, the essentials. Last week we talked about the IIS manager users, a particular user that can be used rather than local users. And today I want to talk about FTP user isolation. How do we isolate the users and protect them from each other? So first off, let me just explain this, is if you want to drop a user off in the root of the site, let's say you have one designer and you're going to drop them off into, let's say, acme.com, the root, then just use this FTP root directory and you're done. No need to listen to the rest of today's video. However, if you want to use more advanced things, let's say you want to drop someone into, you have designer 1, needs to go into a subfolder, designer 2 needs to go into a different set of subfolders, and you want to make sure they do not have access to each other. That's where you can get into the user isolation to really protect the users from each other, and it's important to understand this and how it all works. Also, at first glance, it doesn't seem that powerful, because you're looking in here, where do you see a mapping? How do I say, okay, user X goes to folder Y? There's no setting that you can see here. Well, that's where the user FTP isolation comes in, and it works not by configuration, but by convention, by having folders or virtual directories with the exact names of users. And I'll explain how this works. Now, if we look here, my goal today is to cover these 5 types of users. The FTP root directory, and in fact, we can scratch that off the list. It's done. It just drops into the root. The username directory here with isolation, and also username physical directory with isolation, and also the FTP home directory I'll talk on briefly. So the one that I prefer is this third one. I'll give you a heads up that in most cases, unless I want something plain and simple, I'll use this FTP root directory. Otherwise, we can use this username directory, and we'll get to that. But to lead up to that and to understand how some of this convention configuration works in IIS FTP, let's look at this next one here. Username directory, and this works like it did in IIS 6. So if you're familiar to the IIS 6 way, the default setting in IIS 6 was this one here. So let's take a look at how this works. So we're going to apply. So what we're going to do is, first off, let's create ourselves a user, and that we can use for testing here. And let's just create the new user, and let's call it Tom, just because it's easy to type. I'm going to be typing it a few times. But you can have whatever you want, the name of the user. So we're going to create this user. Done. I'm not going to add him to any particular group. And I am going to go to my permissions here, acme.com, and I'm going to have to add Tom with, let's say, read and write permissions, because we want to allow him to make changes. Then I need to take that user and add him to our FTP authorization. And so we go here, and let's add an allow user for Tom here. Give him read and write permissions. Okay, so now Tom should be able to connect. Let's go here and go to our FTP, and let's log in here as the Tom we just created and connect, and we can see that we're in successfully. Okay, so now let's look at the differences here. What really happens with the username directory isolation? So the username directory is what's selected. Here's where it gets fun. If we navigate here and create a new folder called Tom, notice this, I've called that folder exactly the same name as my user. Now in here, let's just do something to make it stand out. We're going to create a file and called in Tom folder, let's say. Okay, so we go back here to FTP, and I restart FileZilla each time because it does cache on us and throws us off. Okay, so I go into the same user, I connect, and look at this. It dropped us off into this in Tom folder. And the way it did it is because the username exactly matched the folder name. Now notice here on the remote site or on the site, it dropped us into a subfolder called Tom. It doesn't mask the fact that it's in a subfolder. In fact, if I go up a folder, notice I can see default.ispx. So it's not isolated. In fact, if we were to go here and create not just a Tom, let's create a Sally and a Bob too. So now we have a few different folders, and now if we go back in here and refresh, notice that this Tom user is able to see all the users. Now let's look at their NTFS permissions, because you may say, well, let's just remove Tom from the root. right? And then we can lock it all down with NTFS permissions, which we kind of did back in the IIS 6 days. So if we go in here and to our acme.com security, and let's take Tom and drop him from here, but instead we're going to give him access to just his Tom folder. Okay, and we for Tom, and we'll give him access with modify rights. Now let's try this and connect. And look at this. User cannot log in. Home directory is inaccessible. So you can see that he needs some type of permissions to the root. Let's find out what. And it turns out that he needs at least list permissions. So we have to give, if we give Tom just list permissions to the root, and so let's recap this here. We have, let's refresh so we can see the folders. In acme.com, we have list permissions. When Tom, we have read and write permissions. Now if we try to connect as a Tom user, we can go and we're dropped into this Tom folder. And we see some cache in here. Let's close this off and open it again. But you can see where the security concern is, because if we move up a folder, there, now we have these extra users that we actually potentially do have access to. Now that seems easy enough, except we can take it a step further. That was a physical folder. Now we start playing with virtual folders. What if we were to create a virtual directory, a virtual folder on top of acme.com, call it Tom, and let's point it to, how about the root of inetpub? He's a high privilege user. We want to give him access to multiple sites, right? So what we have here is a physical and a virtual directory, both coexisting at the same time. Now if we try to log in, what's going to happen is it will catch the virtual directory wins in that fight, and now he has access to where you redirected him to. See the pattern? We have two types of ways to catch a user, a physical directory or a virtual directory. If a virtual directory exists, it always wins in that fight. Now what if you have just a virtual directory without the physical? So let's go back here and we're going to explore, and we're going to remove the Tom folder. And so now it's been removed, but we still have the virtual folder. Okay, it's going to work. So watch. Confirms that it works fine. Okay, but here's the gotcha. Let's move up a folder here and notice we don't see the Tom folder. So there's two ways to address this missing folder, because what happens is a virtual directory is not seen in the FTP client by default. And in IIS 6, the way that you would show it is you would always have to create that dummy folder. So I could actually do it here. Except I don't have enough permissions because I only have less permissions. So we'll have to do it back here and explore and create this called Tom. So now if we go back to our FTP and do a refresh, notice it shows our Tom directory. But if I double click on it, the vdir went out and I was redirected to the virtual directory location. But there's another way now in IIS 7 that we can do this instead. And so let's delete this Tom user to prove that it doesn't need to be there anymore. And if we go to the FTP directory browsing, there's this new setting here, virtual directories. And so it will show virtual directories to the FTP client. So if we hit apply, and actually first of all, let's show you that let's do it. I applied it without it being there. And we'll save. We're going to look at this. And okay, so notice that if we move up a folder, we don't see the Tom folder. So now if we save it, apply, and go back here and refresh, it actually shows it. So this allows us in IIS 7, it's new to IIS 7, it didn't work in IIS 6, to actually show virtual directories. And that virtual directory setting works for any of these modes, the user isolation modes. So it is a setting that you may want to consider, at least be aware of, on the difference on what that is. And again, it's if the physical folder doesn't exist, the question is, do you show the user through the FTP client the virtual directory? Here's a gotcha though. It's what you would call security through obscurity, because if this is unchecked and you don't see the Tom user, let's try this one more time. And let's restart this. and we move up a folder, notice we don't see the Tom folder, but if I were to manually type it, it actually redirects us to it. So you don't have true isolation even if you don't show that. So if we go back here to, we've now covered this first one. Most of what you need to know. I did cover it fast. Hopefully you're able to follow that. You don't have to watch it 2 times to figure it out. But the username directory means that if the folder exists, it will catch it. And a physical folder will catch it, but a virtual folder has even more authority and it will catch it further. This is what we call the username directory. But this does not isolate the users, and it's possible to move up a folder and to move into another user's folder this way. Okay, so now to get into true isolation, we have 3 other options here. We have this username directory and username physical directory. It's kind of confusing the wording to know which is which. And then potentially we have an FTP home directory configured in Active Directory. So let's see, just to mix it up a little bit, let's look at this last one first. FTP home directory configured in Active Directory. In this case, if you go to a domain controller, and that it's attached to, of course, you can actually go and find a particular user. And if you go to the profile, see this local path? It's possible for you to set a path that is used by IIS FTP, which is kind of cool. And I think it'd make a lot more sense in a corporate environment than it would for a web host. For example, where I hang out as a web host, you may want to have different mappings on different servers. This is a once only for their user, for their Active Directory user. So for that reason, it's really not that practical if you want to have customizations over time. I've never used the FTP user isolation apart from testing. But that doesn't mean that you won't. It would make a lot more sense in a corporate environment. So that gives you an idea of what that is. And it's okay, we've covered 3. Now let's look at these last 2. These ones get a little bit more tricky, but it follows the same concepts as the previous ones. So let's look at this one next. Username physical directory. And the gotcha here is it doesn't honor a vdir. And that's one of the drawbacks, one of the reasons why I don't use it. And so it drops it off to whatever the physical directory is only. But it does have this enable global virtual directories. And what that means is if there is a vdir in the root. So if I were to create a vdir here called images, and we were to drop that off into a folder, let's say, like this, then with this setting here, enable global virtual directories, the user will actually see this images folder and actually see the Tom as well. So depending on your situation, you may want to select this if you need those global virtual directories. Okay, now let's take a look at how this works. These 2 here, username directory and username physical directory, require an exact path for this to work. So let's watch it here. If I go to acme.com, explore, new folder, and what you have to do is if you are using a local user, it has to be this exact name, local user, has to exist on physically under acme.com called local user, and then I create another one called Tom. And this is for a local user or for the IIS manager user. If you have a domain, it may be your domain.com, whatever the alias is. For example, at OrcsWeb, we would do OW, and then under here, a user called Tom. So if we have a user called OW/Tom or tom@orcsweb.com, then this will catch him. So I'm going to spend my time here on the local user, but just understand the difference there. So local user, Tom, and then let's create a new file. And we're going to call this in Tom's local user folder. Okay, so if this works correctly, it's going to catch. Now our permissions do not have to be set on the root anymore. So we can drop Tom from the root with any of the isolated user options and save that. And we don't need this user anymore either, so we can remove it. And so now what we do is we're going to go into, let's refresh this. Okay, so local user and Tom, we're going to go edit our permissions, and we're going to add Tom with modify permissions here. Okay, so now we've granted permissions there. Let's give this a try. And see, this worked. So it caught it and it dropped it in Tom's local folder. So notice what it did is we have a subfolder off the root of the site that has to be called exactly local user. It's not case sensitive, although I've seen documentation from someone that mentioned it is, so maybe the earlier versions of IIS FTP 7.5 may have had that requirement. But now it's okay if it's different casing, but it has to be local user and it has to be the username, and then it will catch it. Now if I were to explore, drop this Tom user, what happens here? And if I were to try to connect, and notice it says the home directory is inaccessible. So if the user doesn't exist in the isolation modes, again, let's compare and contrast here. In these three modes here, if the user doesn't exist, it's going to throw an error. In the username directory, if the user doesn't exist, it just drops it to the root of the site. So this one handles that differently. Okay, so you can see how that works. Now there's true isolation between it, because if we explore, we add our Tom user back, and we're going to add Sally. And Tom, we're going to give permissions. We're going to give our Tom user access again. And let's say by mistake, we had given too many permissions to the Sally user, and Tom was given access here as well. Okay, so now we want to see, do we have protection within FTP to keep us from not getting into the Sally account? And the answer for that is absolutely. So with the user isolation, you can only get into the one folder. And so now we dropped into the Tom user. Notice it's already in the root of the site. I can't move up. I can't move around. I can't do anything. Like, there's no hacks that are going to work for you. You can only get into the root of your site. You are truly, truly isolated between these different accounts. So now you may ask, this is the question that I had always asked, why would I want a messy structure like that? I don't want Tom to be in this folder. I want Tom to have access to the images or a subfolder, you know, a sub-site. So this is called, let's say for example, dev, or let's say staging, right? So we have staging. I want Tom to have access to that staging folder and not here. So here's where I think the thinking is on why we'd use this local user and Tom, and especially in IIS 6 days. You would use this in, let's say, a school environment where you want to give every student their own FTP account, and a teacher can then go in afterwards and download the content. Because you don't really care where they end up as long as they're dropped off in a particular folder. In IIS 6, because a vdir is not honored, and this particular setting right now, if I were to create a vdir on top of here, it's not going to be honored. It's not going to be used whatsoever. So you have to use junctions and symbolic links and things like that in IIS 6 to be able to get around that. It was messy. So this is where our next option comes in. And this is the last one I'm showing you, and it's also the one that I prefer for any type of user redirection. Is now we use username directory, but this does honor vdirs. In fact, so much so, let's delete those from disk and start fresh. So we're going to delete the local user. Okay, and we'll go back here and refresh. Notice there's no local user. We're going to now create a new virtual directory called local user. Again, if you have a domain, you'd put in your domain instead, your domain user. Okay, so our physical path is going to be, and you can actually do it to some kind of dummy root. So we can call this local user dummy root. It doesn't get used, right? That's why it doesn't really matter what it's called. So we drop them off here. Now I can create another directory called Tom. Now, for the first time, I get to choose where I want to drop them off. I shouldn't say for the first time. We kind of had it before, but not with the true isolation. So now we go into inetpub, and let's say we want to drop him off into Site 1. We're giving him access to Site 1. And we say OK. and Tom has this. We're going to say edit permissions. We do need to give Tom NTFS permissions. So let's say OK and OK and OK. And now let's try it out. Well, let's do one more thing. Let's explore, and we're going to say in site 1. So now back here, we're going to drop it off. We're going to test it out. And we see in site 1. So you can see that it was able to catch it, dropped them in site 1, but we're at the root of FTP. We can't move up. We're locked in. We're completely secured by IIS FTP in this regard. So this now shows you. Now you could have used a physical directory if you wanted. We could drop this and go into the local user, for example, and create a user called Tom in here. So you now have a choice. It's the same concept as before. You can use a physical directory or a virtual directory, but a virtual directory will always win out in this situation. So to recap this, let's create a new user end-to-end and just kind of watch what we would do to add them on top of this configuration. Local users and groups, users, and let's create a new user called designer. Okay. So we created that user. We're going to now grant them authorization rules here. And I did here from last week when I was testing it, or the week before. So they have read-write permissions. Now we confirm our isolation level is this one here, username directory, under isolated users. And we have a local user, and now we're going to create a virtual directory called designer, and we can drop them off wherever we want to drop them off. So we're going to drop them off, in this case, let's give them access to the acme.com. And finally, we want to grant NTFS permissions, editor permissions, and we're going to add designer with read and write permissions here. So even though this is nested in this deep structure, it's really going to drop him off at the root of the site. So let's try this out. And notice we've dropped them off here. So now we're in the root of the site and we can do whatever we need to do. So designer has access to the root, where Tom, on the other hand, had access to a whole other site. I think I got the password wrong on that. There. And you can see he's dropped off in a completely other place, even though he's logging in to the exact same website, acme.com. So this concludes our discussion on the FTP user isolation. I realize I did move through that quickly, but I hope that you're able to glean the key principles from there. Again, just name a physical directory or a virtual directory exactly the same name as the username, and it will catch. In the situation of a username directory, it has to be off the root of the site. In the case of an isolated user, it has to be in either local user or your domain / the user. And if you use this third option, username directory under isolated users, you get to choose with vDIRs where you drop them off, and you can allow them to manage and go to different places. So next week I want to talk about firewalls and isolation there, and we're going to be looking at, because you have active and passive mode, you have your TLS or your plain text isolation. So thanks for tuning in, and hope to see you again next week.